My daughter abandoned me for her stepmom. Now, years later, she wants me to pay for the wedding her real mom refused to. To begin with, I have to say that I'm genuinely grateful my daughter, Mallory, has a solid bond with her stepmother, Paige. A little background to set the stage: my husband, Garrett, and I didn't have the best marriage. We fell in love when we were young, convinced ourselves that getting married was the natural next step, and soon after, I found out I was pregnant with Mallory. Garrett made an effort to be a good father, at least in his own way, but the truth was, he was incredibly lazy. From the moment Mallory was born, I was the one handling everything: feeding her, changing diapers, staying up all night to soothe her, bathing her, and taking her out for walks. Meanwhile, Garrett played the role of the fun parent, popping in for about an hour each evening after work. During that short window, I'd be scrambling to cook dinner or tidy up, and the moment he finished eating, he'd disappear into his den to play video games. Anytime I asked him to lend a hand, whether it was with Mallory or around the house, he'd brush me off, saying that taking care of the home and the baby was a woman's responsibility, just the way God intended it. This mindset led to constant arguments. I'd beg him to help out because I was completely drained, but he stood his ground, refusing outright. There was one time I got so sick I could barely move, and I asked him, just this once, to take care of Mallory so I could rest. Instead of stepping up, he picked a fight, calling me lazy and comparing me to his mother, who, according to him, never asked his father for help. That sent me over the edge. I reminded him that Mallory was just as much his responsibility as she was mine, yet he never lifted a finger. Furious, I warned him that if he didn't start pulling his weight, I would pack my bags and leave. That seemed to shake him up a little, and though he grumbled about it, he eventually took a leave of absence from work to care for Mallory just so I could get a few hours of sleep. As my maternity leave neared its end, I turned to my mother and asked if she'd be willing to watch Mallory while I was at work. She agreed without hesitation, for which I was incredibly grateful. Garrett's mother, on the other hand, never so much as offered to help, but I didn't dwell on it. What did bother Garrett, however, was my decision to go back to work. He had been trying to convince me to be a stay-at-home wife for a while, but I always refused. Looking back now, I'm beyond thankful that I stuck to my guns because when Garrett's company downsized, he was let go. It was a massive shock to him and to the other employees who were laid off, but when he broke the news to me, I had to fight the urge to panic. We needed that income to cover our household expenses and take care of Mallory. Still, I knew that if I let my anxiety show, it would only make him feel worse, so I reassured him that I would take care of everything financially until he got back on his feet. Since he was now unemployed, I suggested that he look after Mallory during the day so my mom could have a break. At first, he resisted, but after a bit of coaxing, he agreed. But instead of actively caring for our daughter, I'd come home every day to find him planted in the same spot on the couch, glued to his video games while Mallory played on the floor beside him. The basics, feeding her, giving her a bath, even just tidying up after her, were neglected. Time and time again, I'd walk in to find Mallory hungry and disheveled. It infuriated me. Here I was, working tirelessly to support our family, yet my daughter was being overlooked by the very person who should have been watching over her. Our fights escalated during this period. Garrett kept insisting he was searching for a job, but I never saw him go to a single interview. Then, 6 months into his unemployment, he came to me with a new plan. He wanted to enroll in a business course. Apparently, he had always dreamed of starting his own business. While I didn't think it was the right time for that, I at least expected him to discuss it with me first. Instead, I was the last to know. He had already spoken to his parents, and they had agreed to pay his tuition. The fact that he had made such a big decision without even considering my input stung. In hindsight, that should have been my breaking point the moment I walked away. But like a fool, I stayed. So while I continued working and caring for Mallory, Garrett went off to school. Eventually, he graduated and launched his own business, and to my surprise, it actually took off. Soon, he was in a position to start hiring employees, and that's how Paige came into the picture. She was young, fresh out of college, and landed the role of his personal assistant. They spent hours together every day, but at the time, I didn't think anything of it. The idea of Garrett cheating never even crossed my mind. Then, I started noticing something odd. Garrett would bring Mallory to his office more often and insist that she and Paige spend time together. That set off a small alarm in my head, but when I confronted him directly, he swore up and down that I was overthinking things. I let it go until a friend of mine called me one day, telling me she had just seen Garrett sitting at a cafe, holding hands with another woman. She had no clue who the woman was, but from her description, I knew instantly it was Paige. I can't even describe the wave of humiliation that hit me. Not only was my husband cheating, but now, it was only a matter of time before everyone else found out, too. That evening, I decided to put an end to the sneaking around. I told Garrett to invite Paige over for dinner, making it seem like I simply wanted to meet someone who worked so closely with him. He had no idea that I already knew everything. When she arrived, I wasted no time. I looked Garrett dead in the eye and told him I was done with the lies. I knew what was going on, and I wasn't going to tolerate being deceived any longer. The second the words left my mouth, Garrett froze, and Paige went pale as a sheet. I turned to her and said, point blank, that I didn't care if she was sleeping with my husband because, at this point, there was nothing left to salvage in our marriage. Garrett and Paige exchanged nervous glances before she finally admitted that she had fallen in love with him. She claimed it wasn't intentional, that she never meant to hurt anyone, and that she was sorry. But Garrett? Instead of apologizing, he had the audacity to turn it around on me. He demanded to know why I had invited Paige over if I already knew the truth, then accused me of trying to embarrass them. He refused to take any accountability, going as far as to say that I was the one who had failed our marriage first. I let out a bitter laugh as he started listing all the ways I had supposedly driven him away, how I had never kept him satisfied, how I was always too focused on my independence. That was the last straw. I reminded him, in no uncertain terms, that while he was unemployed, while he was off taking his precious courses, it was my job that put food on the table. He scoffed, saying I should have quit once his business took off, but I wasn't about to take that gamble. I told him straight, I wasn't about to throw away my career just because he suddenly decided he was successful. By this point, I was beyond livid. This man had the nerve to blame me for his infidelity, to paint me as the one who had failed, when all I had ever done was work myself to the bone for him, for Mallory, for our home. Garrett had no right to blame me, and I refused to engage in his pointless accusations. Every time he tried to shift the blame onto me, I simply tuned him out. Instead, I turned to Paige, mouthed a quick good luck, and excused myself from the table. At that moment, I knew exactly what I had to do. In a way, my decision to leave actually saved Garrett the trouble of coming up with an excuse to end things himself. The truth was, whatever love I had once felt for him had faded long ago. Since Mallory was born, we had stopped being husband and wife in any real sense, we were just two people sharing a house, nothing more. And considering I had been carrying the weight of the household on my own for years, there wasn't much left to lose by walking away. So, I packed my bags, gathered up Mallory's things, and got ready to leave. Garrett, realizing what was happening, kept asking me what I was doing. I didn't sugarcoat it, I told him flat out that I was leaving and that he could expect divorce papers soon. He tried to argue, saying I was being too cold, that we should take some time to think it over, but I had already spent years thinking about it. I was done. Without another word, I took Mallory and went to stay with my parents for the time being. If you're wondering whether his parents reached out to comfort me or even had a word with Garrett about destroying his family, the answer is no. They didn't say a single thing to him about his infidelity. Later, I found out why. Paige wasn't just young, she also came from a wealthy family. Marrying her meant Garrett was securing his financial future, and as far as his parents were concerned, that was all that mattered. Honestly, I couldn't care less about any of that. My only concern was making sure that, despite everything, Garrett and I could co-parent in a way that was healthy for Mallory. From my initial interactions with Paige, she didn't seem like a bad person, so I hoped she'd be a good stepmother to my daughter. During the divorce proceedings, I took half of Garrett's assets, which turned out to be quite a bit, considering his business was raking in 6 figures. With that, I bought a house for Mallory and me, creating a space that was just ours. Garrett and I settled on shared custody. Mallory stayed with me from Monday to Friday, and he had her from Friday evening until Monday morning, when he'd drop her off at school. As soon as the divorce was finalized, Garrett wasted no time, he moved Paige into his home immediately. Every time Mallory returned from a weekend with them, she would excitedly tell me about the expensive restaurants they dined at, the amusement parks they visited, and all the fun things they did together. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then, I started noticing a shift. Little by little, my daughter began to pull away from me. I was the one enforcing structure, making sure she finished her homework, teaching her small chores like folding her laundry or washing her own dishes. I made sure she ate nutritious meals instead of indulging in fast food every day. Garrett and Paige, on the other hand, were the fun parents. They took her wherever she wanted to go, never made her do anything remotely responsible, and spoiled her with gifts. It wasn't long before she started pushing back against my rules. She'd insist that I buy her expensive things, and when I refused, she'd throw a fit. If I made her do something she didn't like, something as simple as finishing her vegetables, she'd snap at me, saying she wished she could live with Garrett and Paige full-time. Hearing that from my own daughter hurt more than I could ever describe. But I reminded myself that she was just a kid. She didn't understand the bigger picture. When Mallory turned 12, Paige got pregnant with twins. Almost immediately, Mallory became anxious. She constantly asked me if Garrett would still love her once the babies arrived, and I reassured her over and over that nothing would change. Her fear was so strong that I had no choice but to talk to Garrett about it. To his credit, he did sit down with her and promised that she would always be important to him. But then, Mallory made a request. She wanted to spend more time at Garrett's place. He agreed without hesitation, and before I knew it, she was heading over there every Wednesday night in addition to her usual weekends. At first, I wasn't overly concerned. But then, I found out that Garrett had decided, without consulting me, to move Mallory out of her bedroom and into the basement. Her old room was being renovated for the twins. Mallory agreed to it without hesitation, eager to be a part of Garrett's family, but I didn't even find out until after the decision had already been made. By then, she was barely communicating with me at all. She was so focused on being part of Garrett and Paige's new life that I had become an afterthought. Then, after the twins were born, Garrett hit me with another bombshell. Paige didn't want Mallory around for the next 2 months because she needed to give her full attention to the newborns. I was furious. I knew this would devastate Mallory and make her feel like she was being pushed aside. I tried to explain that to Garrett, but he brushed me off, saying he had to prioritize his wife and the twins. When I broke the news to Mallory, she burst into tears. "Why doesn't Paige want me anymore?" she kept asking. I did my best to comfort her, but there was no sugarcoating it. This was going to hurt. After a month, when Garrett finally came to pick her up again, she was over the moon. Later, she gushed about how adorable the twins were and showed me pictures of the basement room they had set up for her. I had to admit it was a nice space. And though it irritated me that she had so easily given up her old room, I told myself that as long as she was happy, that was all that mattered. But then, she started finding more and more excuses to spend extra time at her father's house. She loved looking after the twins, saying Paige needed a break. That rubbed me the wrong way, so I put my foot down. I told Garrett he was not to use our daughter as a babysitter. His response? "That's how siblings bond." I wasn't buying it. Bonding didn't mean changing diapers and feeding babies with a bottle. That was a parent's job, not a teenager's. After some back and forth, Garrett agreed. But Mallory found out, and she was livid. Paige had told her that I had complained about it. Mallory yelled at me, insisting that she wanted to help with the twins. But I knew my daughter. She was desperate to earn Garrett and Paige's love, willing to do whatever they asked just to feel like she belonged. I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to take anything away from her, that I just wanted her to enjoy her teenage years without being burdened with responsibilities that weren't hers. I warned her that what they were doing was parentification, but she didn't care. That was the beginning of the real divide. Mallory started choosing Paige over me at every turn. I never hated Paige, but it cut deep every time my daughter compared me to her stepmother, and not in a good way. Teenagers can be cruel, and Mallory was no exception. One day, after work, I was sitting on the couch, eating some ice cream while watching TV. She walked in, looked me up and down, and without hesitation, sneered, "Wow, you're turning into a fat cow." That moment stayed with me. It wasn't just what she said, it was the way she said it, as if she had no respect for me at all. And I couldn't help but wonder, was this how she spoke to me now because of the way Garrett and Paige talked about me behind closed doors? Mallory's comment took me completely off guard, especially because I wasn't even overweight. When I asked her why she would say something so cruel, she shrugged and told me that Paige had taught her that gluten makes people fat. Apparently, at Garrett and Paige's house, she wasn't allowed to eat anything with gluten in it. I took a deep breath and explained to her that while it's true some people avoid gluten, it's not inherently bad for everyone. More importantly, she had no right to body shame anyone just because she had chosen to follow a particular diet. But that was just the beginning. As the days passed, I could see my daughter changing right in front of me. In almost every conversation, she would mention Paige, what Paige thought, what Paige did, what Paige would say in a certain situation. It was as if she was turning into a miniature version of her stepmother. She started refusing to go outside with me when the sun was out, saying she didn't want to get tanned. She skipped breakfast regularly, convinced that eating less would help her fit into a bikini, one that Paige had bought her a size too small on purpose. Every day, she weighed herself, jotting down her numbers in a little diary. She talked excitedly about how Paige told her she had the potential to compete in beauty pageants if she stuck to the routine. I was livid. Up until that point, I had never really confronted Paige, but I decided that enough was enough. When I reached out to her, she didn't see any problem with what was happening. She casually brushed it off, saying she had simply suggested the idea of a beauty pageant and it wasn't her fault that Mallory had taken it so seriously. I pointed out that Mallory clearly saw her as a second mother and that she needed to be more careful with her words. But Paige just smirked and told me that instead of holding my daughter back, I should be pushing her to be the best version of herself. I was stunned. The sheer arrogance in her tone left me speechless. All I could do was tell her to keep her strange ideologies away from my daughter. Not long after, Garrett called, furious. He demanded to know why I had spoken to his wife that way. When I told him exactly what was going on, I expected him to at least be concerned. Instead, he sided with Paige, saying that Mallory shouldn't be taking things to such an extreme, but that Paige wasn't to blame. I yelled at him, telling him to open his damn eyes. Mallory wasn't just taking suggestions, she was being molded, influenced, changed. But Garrett clearly didn't care enough to listen. I really tried to talk to Mallory, to tell her that she should enjoy her teenage years instead of worrying about things like weight and tanning. But she didn't want to hear it. She shut me out completely. The realization hit me hard. My daughter was slipping further and further away from me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. She stopped coming to me for anything. If her school was planning a trip, she wouldn't even ask for my permission. She would wait until she saw Garrett so he could sign the form instead. Even though I had never once refused to let her go on a trip, it was as if I didn't even exist in her world anymore. I had been pushed to the sidelines, reduced to nothing more than a spectator in my own child's life. I won't lie, this sent me into a deep depression. I felt like I had failed as a mother, like I had lost my purpose. But then, I met Shane. Shane came into my life when I was at my lowest. As we started dating, he saw firsthand how much Mallory's behavior was affecting me. He tried to reassure me, saying that teenagers go through rebellious phases, that she would come around eventually. But the truth was, things only got worse. Mallory and I fought constantly about her falling grades, about her missing assignments, about her general attitude. And when she ran out of things to argue about, she started taking low blows. One of her favorite things to say was how she now understood why Garrett had left me for Paige. No matter how many times I heard it, it cut me to my core every single time. I hate admitting this, but little by little, I started pulling away from my daughter, too. By the time Mallory turned 18 and was preparing to go to college, I thought the worst was behind us. But then, she and Garrett came to talk to me about something important. I assumed it was about tuition, and I was fully prepared to tell Garrett that I would cover half of her college expenses. But instead, he blindsided me with something I never saw coming. Mallory wanted me to give up my rights as her mother. I sat there, stunned, unable to process what I had just heard. She looked me straight in the eye and told me she had been thinking about this for a long time. She wanted Paige to legally adopt her. I felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. At first, I thought I had misheard her, that this was some kind of cruel joke. But then she started pleading with me, saying that she loved Paige more than she loved me and that she wanted her to be her real mother. I asked her why she felt this way, why she thought this was necessary. I was desperate for her to give me something, anything, that would make sense of this. And she did. She spoke with so much conviction, explaining how she felt a deeper connection with Paige, how she admired her, how she wanted to be part of her world. She admitted that part of her decision was financial. If Paige adopted her, she would become eligible for her inheritance, something Paige's parents had made clear. As she talked, I struggled to hold myself together. It felt like my entire world was crumbling around me. Everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed, it was slipping through my fingers. She kept begging me not to fight it, insisting that she had always seen Paige as her real mother. Garrett chimed in, agreeing with her. He told me not to take it personally, that I should respect her wishes. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to react. For weeks, I wrestled with the decision. My parents tried to talk to Mallory, to make her see reason, but she refused to even take their calls. I cried constantly. Shane was the only one who stayed by my side, the only person who saw just how deeply this was breaking me. Even he thought what Mallory was doing was unbelievably cruel. But in the end, I knew I couldn't force my daughter to love me. I couldn't make her stay if she didn't want to. With a heavy heart, I finally gave in. I won't go into the legal details, but after a few weeks, everything was finalized. Paige officially adopted Mallory, and with that, our relationship came to an end. Afterward, Mallory completely cut me out of her life. I can't even begin to describe the pain of those days. For so many years, I had lived for my daughter. I had built my world around her. And now, she was gone. I have to admit, if it weren't for Shane, I don't know how I would have made it through. He was my rock, standing by me when I felt like I had nothing left. He encouraged me to go to therapy and moved in with me just so he could take care of me. During that time, I left my job completely, and he supported me in every way, emotionally, financially, and mentally. It wasn't long before I was diagnosed with depression and had to start medication. Watching Shane rally behind me, refusing to let me slip away, gave me a reason to keep going. Slowly but surely, I started to heal. I stopped blaming myself for everything. Shane suggested I join him in his business, just to keep myself occupied, and I agreed. He was the partner I had always deserved but never had before. I threw myself into my work and into my relationship with Shane, finally finding happiness in the simple joys of life. Over the past 6 years, we built his business together, and he made me an equal partner, giving me a seat at the table, respecting me professionally just as much as he did personally. We got married, and together, we created a life that was filled with love, respect, and peace. Never in my wildest dreams did I expect to hear from Mallory again. But yesterday, out of the blue, she called. Her name flashing on my phone stirred up emotions I thought I had long buried. A whirlwind of feelings, shock, joy, sadness, and fear hit me all at once. After all these years, my daughter had finally remembered me. She asked how I was, told me a little about her life. I wasn't sure what had prompted this sudden contact, but I was just glad to hear her voice. No matter what had happened between us, she would always be my daughter. Legal papers didn't change that. I would always love her, even if she had hurt me in ways I never thought possible. For a moment, I let myself believe that maybe she had matured, that maybe she truly wanted to reconnect and rebuild what we had lost. Then, the conversation took a turn. She told me she was getting married. The words caught me off guard, and despite everything, I felt a wave of emotions: excitement, disbelief, nostalgia. My little girl was getting married. But then she told me the real reason she had called. She wanted me to help pay for the wedding. My initial joy quickly faded into shock. As she went on, explaining how Garrett's business had taken a hit during COVID and never really recovered, how Paige refused to contribute much because she was saving for the twins' future, I sat there, listening in silence. Then she said it outright: she knew I was doing well now. She had been keeping tabs on me, stalking my social media from time to time. Since I was financially stable and happily married, she figured I could afford to cover the costs of her wedding. And, according to her, I basically owed her. I was stunned. All the emotions I had felt at the start of the call, happiness, hope, relief, disappeared in an instant. She wasn't reaching out because she missed me. She wasn't calling because she regretted pushing me away. She had only contacted me because she wanted money. I took a deep breath and told her, as calmly as I could, that while I was happy she had reached out, I wasn't going to just pretend the past never happened. I reminded her that she was the one who had chosen to cut me out of her life, the one who insisted I give up my parental rights so that Paige could adopt her. If Paige was the real mother she had always wanted, then why wasn't she asking her for help? Mallory didn't like that. She argued that, regardless of everything, I was still her biological mother. She told me it wasn't fair that I had so much money now and that giving her a few $1,000s wouldn't even make a dent in my finances. I made my stance crystal clear. I told her that while I wished her nothing but happiness in this new chapter of her life, I wasn't going to finance her wedding. That's when she snapped. She started throwing insults, calling me selfish, saying I had abandoned her, and accusing me of not fighting for her enough all those years ago. It was as if she was grasping at anything she could to justify her actions, twisting the story to make me the villain. At that point, I knew there was no reasoning with her. The conversation was going nowhere, and before I could say another word, she angrily hung up on me. After the call, I found myself wondering, had I made the wrong choice? Should I have just helped her, for old time's sake? I knew I could afford it, so why did it feel so complicated? Then, I did something I hadn't expected. I shared my story online, just looking for a little clarity. I never thought it would blow up the way it did. Hundreds of strangers reached out, telling me not to give in to her demands under any circumstances. When I posted, I had been drowning in guilt, thinking that maybe I was being too harsh. But reading those responses, I started to see things more clearly. Mallory wasn't reaching out to mend our relationship, she just wanted my money. It's hard, as a parent, to stop loving your child, even when they don't want you anymore. No matter what, Mallory will always be my baby. But she's not a child anymore. She has grown into an entitled adult, and I have to accept that. Interestingly, Garrett and Paige never reached out to me about any of this. I suppose they had no idea that Mallory had come to me for money. After thinking it over, I talked with Shane, and we both agreed I wouldn't be helping Mallory financially in any way. At the suggestion of some of the people who commented on my post, I decided to send Mallory one last message. Dear Mallory, I want to express how much I appreciate you reaching out to me and sharing updates about your life. It meant a lot to hear from you, and I'm glad to know you're doing well. Regarding your request for financial assistance with your wedding, I want to be upfront about where I stand. While I understand your desire for support during this important time, I must respectfully decline. Since you chose to cut me out of your life and wanted Paige to adopt you, I believe it's best for us to maintain the distance you wanted. I need to prioritize my own well-being and boundaries. I want nothing but the best for you as you begin this new chapter, and I hope you can respect my decision. Take care, Mom. I sent the message that morning. She saw it. She left me on read. And that was that. I suppose all of you were right, she never really cared about reconnecting. She just wanted a blank check, no questions asked. Shane, seeing how much this whole thing had upset me, suggested I block her number so she couldn't contact me for money again. Up until now, I was hesitant, but now, I know it's the right thing to do. As for my will, for those of you who were worried, I won't be leaving anything to Mallory. Shane and I don't have children together, but he has nieces and nephews, and we plan to leave everything to them. I appreciate all the advice and support I've received. Moving forward, I will focus on my own happiness, cherishing the life I have built with my husband. Because in the end, I have finally learned, sometimes, the best thing you can do for yourself is to let go.